So now with that tremendous introduction, I'm going to introduce our keynote presentations. So our keynote session today will focus on the effects of stigma with perspectives from persons with lived experience. The stigma of addiction keeps many people from talking about their disease and seeking treatment. For this reason, it is so important to lift up the stories of those who are willing to share them so that we can break the silence and help save lives. I am so pleased to introduce our keynoters, Marcie Massa and Maegan Kenney, who will be sharing their stories with us today. Marcie and Maegan are both Shatterproof ambassadors, Marcie hailing from Chicago and Maegan from Boston. As Shatterproof ambassadors, Marcie and Maegan are part of a national network of volunteer peer leaders, educating and empowering others to learn about and support Shatterproof's mission of reversing the addiction crisis in the United States. They will each share their personal experiences with the stigma of addiction and how it has impacted them and their families. Marcie and Maegan, thank you so much for being with us today. Marcie, we will start with you and then turn to Maegan.
Can
You're
you guys
good,
hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you this morning. It's always an honor to be speaking on behalf of Shatterproof and their mission and to be my brother's voice. On May 4th of last year, I became a sister to an angel. My younger brother, Tony, at 42 would relapse for the first time in 3 years, and it would be his last. I knew early on after losing my brother, I needed to park my pain in a place of purpose. It pains me when I think of what my brother's years of struggling not only did to him personally, but the impact it had on our family. See, prior to my brother going into a recovery program where he lived for 13 months, graduated, and entered recovery, we lived in silence. We hid the addiction with him for fear of judgment. I looked up the definition to stigma. It's defined as a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or a person. Disgrace. The word in that definition really strikes a chord with me. That very word is how those struggling with addiction have been made to feel. Shame and guilt are a huge factor that keep those struggling stuck in their disease. Unfortunately, like many families, we didn't realize how great that stigma affected our family until my brother had passed. Society's views of addiction made us feel we couldn't share the elephant in the room. Stigma gives you a visual of some scary person walking around with a needle in his or her arm, someone who lives on the streets or under a bridge. It doesn't tell you how handsome my brother was, how he had a heart the size of Texas. Yes, behind closed doors, our sweet, loving family had been affected by addiction. It's true, you can come from the best home on the planet and addiction will still live within your walls. I often beat myself up now as I look back. I was ashamed to share his struggles when he was alive. Why on earth did I care about others' opinions? Our family let the stigma guide our thoughts. It told us we should stay silent. It told us not to take the time to educate ourselves on the fact that addiction is a condition that alters your brain. All these truths came crashing down as I joined grief support groups from addiction loss. Thousands upon thousands sharing all the same stories of their loved ones. Negative perceptions associated with addiction affected my brother's self-esteem daily. Like so many others, the stigma told him he was a disgrace, and as a result, he suffered in silence, which prevented him from reaching out and asking for help. That is why you're seeing me speak today. There needs to be a change in the way we view those who struggle. The stigma tells you that those who struggle in addiction don't try. I'm here to tell you that stigma lies. Many people discount the lives of those lost as a result of addiction. Focus is placed upon the death path versus the goodness in their lives. I'm here to tell you, in every life there is goodness. In my brother's life, there was great goodness. Addiction was such a small part of who he was. I wish people could know how much time my brother spent alone, thinking, praying, and crying out about his addiction. At expressing the loneliness and isolation he felt due to his struggles. The hardest thing I've ever had to read was his journal I found in his room a few days after his passing. This journal I hold is full of page after page of heartfelt cries on loneliness and disappointment in himself. If you've ever had doubts of how those struggling feel, Please use this journal I hold in my hands as a visual for your hearts. They want help, but the stigma silences them time and time again. He was the sweetest, most kind, loving individual you'd ever meet. He'd gone on until his final relapse, helping others in their struggles. Addiction wasn't the entirety of him. Each of us today struggles of some sort. Maybe it's an addiction, depression, anxiety, food. Imagine if all those around you only focused on your struggle. What would that feel like daily for you? My brother and our family unfortunately witnessed that very stigma in the hospital. Tony had a medical issue related to a relapse, and the nurse couldn't have been any more unkind if she tried. Her actions to my brother whispered, "You don't matter." If stigma filters through hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing care, and treatment facilities, it will continually discourage people from seeking out treatment. In speaking with numerous amounts of grieving families, this reality is all too familiar. Reverse the shoes. If you went to get help and were treated poorly, would you want to seek treatment again? Chances are you too would walk away in shame. You would let the stigma tell you, yes, you are worthless. There is no hope. Please see them for more than their disease. Their lives are depending on it. They are somebody's someone. They are my brother. Why must we live in a world without compassion until it becomes someone they know? 80% of the public views addiction as a personal failing, a weakness, or a character flaw. Until these views begin to change, countless lives will be lost. We must learn to start treating addiction like any other disease so lives can be changed. It's alarming that with all the education, facts, and statistics that are out there, that this epidemic isn't getting better. It's getting worse. In 2019, more than 70,000 people were lost to the opioid epidemic. The Chicago Bears NFL football stadium seats over 61,000 people. Think of that for a moment. The entire stadium filled with an additional 10,000 extra on the field. That's how many beautiful lives were lost to this crisis. It's more than a need for willpower or the just say no mentality. Addiction requires managed treatment. Addiction requires the stigma to end. This starts with you and me. Each of you joining this conference today has the power to take a step towards that change. It is my hope that today can be a day of change in your hearts. On the very day my brother died, one of the last things he said to my mom was, "Mom, I'm struggling to find my purpose." Even though our hearts are broken, he's no longer with us. It's become clear to me that the purpose he so desperately searched for on earth will go on in his death. I will continue to be his voice. Please educate yourself to know that addiction does not discriminate. Don't think this will never happen to my child. Thousands lost each year are young children and adults that made a fatal mistake to try something just once. With that said, I'd like to leave you with a short video. What touches me more than anything is to see the beautiful faces of just some of those lost to addiction. It helps tremendously to break down the barriers. Tony could have been your child, your sibling, neighbor, friend. It's not those other kids. These are all our children.
Everyone, the time come when all of us say goodbye. Feel that aching in your heart, leaving you broken inside. But we're never really gone, as long as there's a memory in your mind. So now go do the best things in life. Take a bite of this world while you can. Make the most of the rest of your life. Make a ride of this world while you can. Take the ones you love and hold them close, because there is your heart. I know it feels hopeless sometimes, but they're never really gone as long as there's a memory in your mind. So now go do the best things in life. Take a bite of this world while you can. Make the most of the rest of your life. Make a ride of this world while you can. And hold on to memories. Hold on to every moment to keep them alive. The world's greatest tragedy, souls who are not remembered cannot
Thank you so much for the opportunity today to share my brother's story. May the change begin with you and me.
Thank you so much, Marcie. Your remarks were beautiful, and I think I can speak on behalf of everyone listening in that we're so grateful that you're able to be your brother's voice now that he's no longer with us. And please continue to do the good work that you're doing and spreading these important messages.
Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Thank you. Now I'm pleased to introduce Maegan Kenney, who will also share her remarks with us.
Thank you, everybody. Marcie, that was a beautiful tribute to your brother. And I think when we sort of see these stories and, we speak from experience, whether that be firsthand or as a loved one, I think we really sort of appreciate the battle that we have ahead of us. And then also, the opportunities to speak to these types of experiences, which, are not always easy. So I appreciate you and I thank you for sharing. I think for me, right now as a fourth year clinical PsyD graduate student in clinical psychology, coming up on 8 years in recovery this July, amazingly, which is wild to just think about. I sort of look at my journey to this point and I recognize how much stigma has played a role in a variety of different ways, starting when I was actively using and trying to seek help. And also just now as a professional in the field, who has this history and has definitely been stigmatized in a variety of ways for that. So I guess I'll just start with saying that when I was actively using, there were some experiences that definitely compounded the problem, that amplified the immense shame and pain that I was in at the time. I just want to sort of bring to light that I think oftentimes people who are actively using get stigmatized in a variety of different ways, as we're talking about today. But I think what we fail to recognize is the massive amount of emotional pain that the person is likely in, that either drove them to use that substance in the first place, or that's keeping them in a pattern that they just can't seem to get themselves out of, despite the fact that they desperately want relief. And so I can put myself back into that place and remember the times that I would do my best to try to figure out a way out of the hole that I was in. And I had tried lots of different medications. And I remember at one point I had learned about Vivitrol. And I was, as I described it, sort of like 1 foot in and 1 foot out of my recovery process at that time, because I was still sort of trying to negotiate the terms of my own recovery plan. And I was using Vivitrol, but I wasn't using it the way I really should have been. And I was still trying to sort of, use in between. And I remember at one point that, I had detoxed myself at home. That was sort of like the way that I treated myself because of this stigma. I didn't want to go to the hospital that was in my town and have to admit the problem that I have. I knew people in my town. I didn't want to go to a meeting and raise my hand and say I had this problem because everybody in the town knew my family, and I didn't want to shame my family. And my family, most of my family didn't even know that I was struggling, some of my extended family members. So that was a lot of pressure. And so I remember trying to manage this all on my own. And I remember detoxing myself in my house and had made it a few days, and I'd still had some buprenorphine left in my system. But I knew that I was vulnerable, and I knew that the second that I sort of got back out into the real world that I was probably going to use. And so I had a prescription of naltrexone, and I thought I was at a safe place with the amount of opioids that I still had left in my system to take it and not put myself into precipitated withdrawal. And that did not happen. I got incredibly sick, and I had to go to the emergency room. And now I was faced with multiple dilemmas. I was incredibly physically ill. I was psychologically tortured, and it was all manifesting in that moment, and it was sort of all crashing in on me. And then I had to go to the hospital in my town and then do the one thing that I absolutely had avoided for years, which was admit that I had a problem to people that I was afraid were going to judge me and people who were pretty close to me geographically. And so I walked into that emergency room sick and desperate and at a point where I was sort of broken and just willing to take whatever help I could get. And I will never forget the experience that I had with that emergency room physician who, when I walked into the emergency room with my mother and said, I'm an only child and I'm very close with my mother and we have a great relationship. It's okay that she's here. He told me, well, you know what, I'm going to have your mom leave the room so you and I can talk. And when he did that, he then turned to me after my mom left the room and said, okay, so now that your mom's not here, why don't you tell me the truth? And I said, well, Doc, I am telling you the truth. I'm struggling. I've been trying to help myself. I took the naltrexone. Now I'm sick and I need some fluids. I know I'm dehydrated. You know, can you please help me? And he insisted that I was lying, that there was no possible way I could have been this sick from the amount that I was telling him that I took in the interaction. He then asked me the severity of my drug use as a way to sort of make me prove how bad I really was. And I remember in that moment pulling my sleeve up and showing him the cyst that I had in my arm and explained to him that I had been crushing up pills and injecting them. And that I was at a place right now where I was so broken that I was just desperate for help. And he looked at me and said, well, you might as well be shooting hamburger meat into your veins because that's what you're doing to yourself. And I remember these experiences with this doctor being so devastating to me. And I still even just get worked up now when I tell the story because the shame and the pain had kept me away from seeking help. And here I was at a place so desperate for somebody who was supposed to be a professional, who was supposed to sort of have the skills to be able to talk to me and maybe hold me in that moment, you know, psychologically, to be able to say, like, you may not have any hope in yourself right now, but I do. And here are some options and here are some ways that you can help yourself. Luckily, that was a turning point for me. I was sort of not capable of withstanding any more pain from all of these different angles that I ended up recommitting to a Vivitrol program with a new doctor and started to take it really seriously. And I will say, I think large in part, my commitment to that program, the fact that I was able to stay on Vivitrol for 3.5 years, start a master's program with a year of recovery under my belt, and then proceed right into a doctoral program. So now 7 years straight of master's and doctoral level education. I'll be done in about 1.5 years. That all came from the Vivitrol doctor that I went to go and see actually believing in me in that moment when I told him that this was the way that I wanted to run my recovery, and that I had tried different medications and that I had diverted them each and every time, and that I was not successful with them and I did not take them seriously. And therefore they weren't going to be an option for me at this point because I needed to take a turn. And the Vivitrol was an option. I just felt like I needed to sort of shift my perspective on it a little bit. And I felt like I was at that point. And he listened to me with compassion. He honored what I had to say. He respected my education as a user, that I knew what I was talking about when it came to these medications and the ways that I was using them and how they were going to help me and how they weren't going to help me. And he really let me drive the boat on my healthcare decision-making process at that point. And that is exactly what I needed. I was not somebody that should have been doubted. I was not somebody that should have been challenged when it came to what I believed was going to help me. And I should not have been somebody, just like anybody, Marcie's brother, anybody that we know that's ever struggled, people that have passed from this because they didn't get the help that they needed, should have never been discarded the way that I was in that emergency room that day. And if I had not found that Vivitrol doctor, I may not be here speaking to all of you because I may have succumbed to the pressure of the institutional and personal stigma that were perpetuated against me that day in that emergency room. It's kind of funny because years later, I ended up working for that hospital with that doctor who did not know who I was and praised me for being an absolute rock star in the behavioral health department for the job that I did. And I still never had the guts to tell him who I was. So that's sort of like a funny point to the story. I mean, I think overall, I'll just sort of end with my experience of being a master's student, having a history of addiction, being very public about my experience because I do not want to see any more people suffer. And I think we can talk a lot about stigma, and we can have conferences like this, and we can even put out calls to action. But I think you really see the underlying feelings, the unconscious biases, the microaggressions that we experience on a daily basis from even people in the field who may be conscious of it and aware of it and may be doing it intentionally, but maybe not. And I've had experiences now with this history of mine being brought back to the surface as a way for people to discredit what I have to say or judge me in some way, stigmatize, or essentially discriminate against me. And so I'd like to say that 8 years in recovery, that stigma and that shame goes away. I would say the shame goes away because I make it go away, because I speak about it and because I call it to the table. And I'm not afraid to call out the fact that within our communities, the recovery community, the mental health community, we are perpetuating stigma left and right. And that is the problem, because if we don't recognize that within the community we are perpetuating the problem, we cannot expect society as a larger whole to respond the way that we actually deserve to be responded to. So it's sort of my perspective is sort of we have to work in and then work out. And so it's the reason why I'm so passionate as a professional in the field with this coupled lived experience. I'll also note that my dad's in recovery. He and I actually host a podcast together called the Addictionary Podcast, in which we share all of our experiences and opinions and points of view about all of this. He's not a professional in the field. And so we balance our perspectives on this, and it often comes back to the same place. There's a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of stigma that's not talked about. And as long as we're addressing it and we're actually willing to be brave enough to say this is happening, and it's happening from the people that we least expect it from, then we might be able to see some changes made. And so I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen to what we have to say as people with experiences. I think when we can speak from these experiences and we can show the nuanced challenges of what it's like to be in active addiction, to be in recovery, to be a loved one, family member, to be a professional in the field, we really start to recognize the gravity of this problem. And we only make changes when we're willing to speak about it. And so that's what we're doing today. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us. This is an incredibly important topic. And I encourage everybody to try to think about ways in which you can start to change your interactions with people with this experience, or the way you talk about this in the most subtle of ways. Think about the really small exchanges, the conversations that you have with people, and the ways in which you talk about this subject that might be contributing to the overall problem. It's these little changes that we can make that actually end up making the big waves. And so that's what I encourage you all to do. And so I thank you all.
Maegan and Marcie, thank you so much for sharing your stories and powerful messages with all of us today. Again, on behalf of the NAM and everyone watching this webinar, I really hope that you both will continue to do the good work that you're doing and continuing to break down the barriers around addiction. And particularly with respect to stigma. I think you've certainly reaffirmed for all of us that we still have very far to go in dismantling stigma. And certainly we hope that through our work, we can help you and your colleagues make a difference and change this culture that continues to persist, unfortunately. And in addition, you have also provided a very powerful backdrop for our first expert panel session, which is going to focus specifically on addressing the stigma surrounding opioid use disorder.